Hello and welcome to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And you can see today's topic is the Middle Ages, the medieval times, the Dark Ages. Now, as always, before we begin, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline to the right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the left. Got it? Let's get started. Now, we're going to recap a little bit here of the end of the Roman Empire and discuss what happens next in Europe, which of course is the Middle Ages, as you can see by my title. And so in 476 CE, the Roman Empire, at least the western half of it, collapses. And it's going to create chaos in Western Europe. There were no longer any unifying governments, laws, armies, or even educational systems. And after the fall of the Roman Empire, what does seemingly unify Western Europe is Christianity. It came to dominate in many areas that were formerly controlled by the Roman Empire, but still did not unite the lands together. Instead, they break off into kingdoms and eventually into modern-day countries. And so, in this way, it is similar to Islam that dominates the lands that were controlled by the caliphates, except Islam united the lands. Christianity did not. Instead, we get this patchwork of tribal kingdoms that emerge in Western Europe. Many of the Germanic tribes were influenced by and embraced Roman culture. And as we know, Germany did not exist as a nation until the late 1800s, and we're still in circa 500 CE. And while the Byzantine Empire we'll get to at the end of the lecture today will emerge in the Eastern Mediterranean, Western Europe is in complete and total chaos. And what we get here is the Middle Ages, medieval times, knights in shining armor in their ladies' fair, or also known as the Dark Ages. So this period of history takes place between the fall of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Renaissance. Was it the Dark Ages? Well, in some ways, yes. As far as repression, literature, the arts, in many ways, it could be considered the Dark Ages. But while I pose that question on my introduction slide today, please note, it's only the Dark Ages if you adopt a very Eurocentric or Western-centric mindset. Because the reality is, as we talked about in our last lecture regarding, Islam, that world is thriving and developing artistically and educationally and scholarly. Out in China, things are beginning to turn around in China. And so while we call it the Dark Ages, that only embraces what we're discussing in Western Europe today. So what does happen in Western Europe? Well, we do see the collapse of political, social, and military order that will leave chaos in Europe. We will see a continuation and continuous bouts of invasions and conflicts, especially from those Germanic tribes and the nomadic peoples. Farming becomes subsistence once again. In other words, we're not producing crops for an entire empire, but rather for your family or for your town. Many towns are ruled by chieftains, and most people will be illiterate, hence the term Dark Ages. The church does provide cultural unity and does enable the area to regain some control, as the church itself remains intact despite the fall of Rome. And the church will end up fulfilling most of the duties of the defunct Roman Empire. Most Western Europeans will flood the church seeking spiritual comfort as well as social and political stability. The Pope became both a religious leader and the de facto political leader, merging the church and state. And so in the medieval Europe, the church is on top. The Pope is on top of the hierarchy, and he will even be elevated above any local king. If you know anything from history, you watch any kind of movies about knights, you will always see that the kings of Europe have to go to the Pope to be coronated. Or the Pope is the one granting that power and authority for the king to rule. Now, under the Pope is your archbishops and cardinals. Below them are the bishops, and then the lowest level is your priest, your monk, or your nun. And the monks and the nuns were primarily missionaries and educators. The nuns specifically also being the social workers of the area. They will run hospitals, orphanages, and schools. And to be clear, the option to become a nun will give many women opportunity for leadership in the community, something that had previously been excluded. Now, I'm not trying to say the medieval period was a glorious time to be a woman or open new waves of feminism, but compared to the previous era, the availability of becoming a nun does open some new doors and avenues of career opportunities for women. Now, that's the spiritual side of things. On the secular leadership, it is mostly local only. Landowners or lords will run huge, large manors or large estates. Poor, landless people known as serfs will work the land. These landowners, these lords, will hire private soldiers, who are also known as knights, to protect the lord's land from all sorts of invaders. And as time went on, the constant winner of these battles would gain enough power, enough land to declare themselves a king. And again, that king is subservient to the Pope. And so the Roman governors were replaced by tribal chieftains. The Roman concept of rule of law was replaced with informal governments based on family ties and loyalty. And people settled on manors, with feudalism or manorialism developing, which is a complex system of mutual obligations that we'll get to in a minute. I want to give you a couple of examples of this, how this actually plays out in practicality. So that's the kind of the overview of it. In practicality, you get people like Charles the Hammer Martel. So he was a Christian leader of the Germanic Franks, and he is going to defeat the Muslim army at the Battle of Tours in 732 CE. He will push Muslims out of Europe and back into the Muslim-controlled Iberian Peninsula we talked about previously in Spain. So he wins this decisive battle over the Muslims. He pushes their power, their presence back into the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, and he is going to assume control of this kind of Franco region. Now, his grandson is the great, well-known Charlemagne, who will temporarily unite much of modern France, Germany, and even northern Italy into what he recalled the new Roman Empire. And he becomes known as the father of Europe. He will rule the Carolingian Empire from 768 until 814 CE. And he's able to do so because, number one, his grandfather, first of all, pushed out the Muslims and began that process of unification. He was able to rule a large region, geographic region, and he was able to create both a vast military network to push back Vikings' incursions and a bureaucratic administrative state that will rule the region. He will standardize weights and measures, and he will act like an old imperial ruler, though on a much smaller scale compared to, say, the old Greek, Persian, Roman Empire. But what he also sets off is he begins a power struggle for European political dominance and authority between the church and secular leaders. He will famously be crowned the Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day, December 25th, in 800 CE. This gave the implication that he was the heir to the Roman throne. He will become known as the defender of the faith in spreading Christianity, Catholicism. But while he united his kingdom by himself, remember, he took over in 768, and he was ruling this vast empire. By accepting that title, that crowning by the Pope, and the title Defender of the Faith by the Pope, again, Pope Leo III, it is showing the superiority of the church over political leaders. And so what we see developing here during the medieval period is it's the church that is dominant, not rulers, not kings, not monarchs. the church. And then after his death, the empire will fragment. The Treaty of Verdun will be signed, and his empire will be divided after his death in 814. But this fracture is going to lead to some new type of governments in the region, in Western Europe. It will create the Holy Roman Empire, which is mostly just modern-day Germany and surrounding environs. And that will continue from 936 until 973 CE. It will also create new types of kingdoms. This is where we really get our modern image of what medieval times, the Middle Ages, was. And of course, that is feudalism. These new kingdoms that develop are a highly fragmented, highly decentralized society. Europe became full of thousands of independent and isolated estates or manors. Gave rise to this new system in Europe called feudalism. This is a political, economic, and social system based on loyalty and military service. Let me repeat that. Feudalism. A political, economic, and social system based on loyalty and military service. Power is exercised by monarchs and land-owning elites or lords. And then there are lesser lords who are called vassals. These are people who would enter into a mutual obligation with a higher lord or monarch. And basically, the lesser lords, these vassals, gave military protection, or used their basically bodies to provide military protection, support. And in return, they would get land or fiefs from the monarch or the landowning elites, those manors, those lords. These fiefs, which are estates that came with serfs to work the land. So you are offering to give protection, like you basically become a knight. So you will provide military protection for a lord or a lesser monarch. In return, they will give you a fief. That's F-I-E-F, which is a land, estate, that comes with people to work it, serfs. Now, the nobility of this era consists of lords, ladies, and knights. A lord has almost complete and total authority over his fief. A lady has few, if any, rights. And for entertainment, tournaments were held, of course, jousting, sword fighting, etc. And then, of course, other ones would become other entertainments such as archery, big dinners, minstrels, jesters, singers. And of course, the most famous of this era were the knights. Boys became knights by starting as an assistant or a page. Usually about age 7, they will work for a lord. At age 15, he'll become a squire who assisted the knight. And once he proved himself in battle, he was then knighted in a ceremony. And knights were told to behave, but governed by a code known as chivalry, which is the basis for good manners in Western society. In other words, you treat the weaker sex women fairly, you go out of your way to help them, but you act in an honorable, fair manner. Now, at the same time that this is going on, we also developed a system called manorialism. Now, I'm going to move my little screen here so you can get a better picture of this comparison chart. And so, you see it. Manorialism is defined as both an economic and political obligation between the lords and peasant laborers. You see, serfs that worked on the manors are tied to the land. Now, in return, they receive protection, justice, and the right to graze animals. In return, however, they are obliged to give a portion of their products to the lord. Peasants lived on and worked the lord's land, and this agricultural system is known as manorialism. And this is separated from feudalism, which is the social and political system. So the economic system is manorialism. The social political system is feudalism. Now, again, the serfs will work the land. They provide farming, herding, weapon making. And most peasants of this area were indeed serfs. Move my picture back down. Now, this is an important note. Serfs are not technically slaves. Slaves, by definition, belong to a master, to a person. They are enslaved by a person. A serf is someone who was tied to the land. In other words, they were bound to that land even if the Lord changed. They are not the specific property of a specific person. They are not the personal property of a specific person. However, they are also people who can't leave the Lord's manor without permission. So are they technically enslaved? No. By most accounts, they're still treated and kind of perpetuate the idea of a slave-master relationship. But again, technically speaking, they are not slaves. Now, around 1000 CE, things will begin to change. We will start seeing some signs of recovery. And a lot of this has to do with contact with the outside world. Innovations from Eastern Europe and Asia began to make their way into Western Europe, including the moldboard plow, the three-field system that gives peasants a better opportunity to grow food, and also for a state or kingdom to grow more food to supply a kingdom-sized, rather than just a local-sized population. A horse collar, which makes plowing easier, and stirrup, which makes riding horses easier. Better agricultural methods were promoted by monasteries, these monks. And Viking raids became less frequent and less serious as governments grew stronger. The population would increase with this agricultural production, which created more demand for trade, and towns would grow as a result. Feudalism was becoming discouraged due to the growth of powerful central governments. The political power of the church countered the power of kings. But that means the friction between the Pope and the kings grew. Nobles resisted the growth of strong central governments because they enjoyed their independence that came with feudalism and manorialism. And within the Holy Roman Empire, the German princes, and also in Eastern Europe, will remain feudalistic. But in the West, in places like England, France, we start to see the growth of shedding itself of feudalism and the growth of larger kingdoms led by monarchs again. This became very prominent following the passage of the Magna Carta, which advocated for a government that was strong but limited by the people who were under its rule. The idea that the parliament was created to give the people a voice in policymaking, at least in theory. And these, of course, ideas will lead to the growth of modern democracies. Of course, one of the two big things that truly end the Middle Ages, number one, trade. The increase in trade goods and contact with Eastern Europe and Asia by the Silk Road trade, by the Mediterranean Sea trade, they are going to play a major role in ending the Middle Ages, or what we now are calling the High Middle Ages. And that's because as they're trading goods, yes, these technologies and trade goods are important, but also, of course, ideas, innovations, cultural changes. And then along with that, we also see what we'll talk about next, the Crusades, which while they are an abject failure as far as taking back the Holy Land, they will lead to the Renaissance. And it's the combination of the Crusades and trade that both will create contact with the outside world, specifically Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and China, that are going to end the Middle Ages. So, with that, let's talk about the Crusades. Now, the Crusades, they are a series of 9 holy wars that were led by Western European Christians to so-called recapture the Holy Lands in the name of Christianity and to spread Christianity. They take place over several centuries, between 1095 and 1295 CE. They are authorized by the Pope, and it was the belief that these were God's commands to retake the Holy Land. Now again, the main kind of goal here, number one, was to win back the Holy Land from Muslim control. The secondary reason was to spread Christianity. However, that was only the religious causes. A second major cause was political. You see, one was religious, number two is political. You see, the Byzantine Empire was eager to retake land it had lost to the Seljuks, the Muslim invaders. And despite the religious split that occurred in 1054, the Western Church was eager to help the Eastern Church at first, because it was meant to retake the Holy Land from these so-called evil Muslims. So, religious reasons, political reasons, but also economic reasons. Trade. Europeans were hooked on luxury goods from Asia, and the idea of if Constantinople were to come under control of Muslims, those luxury goods would be cut off or would be sold at a much higher price. So the idea for Western Europeans and even some Eastern Europeans was that if they control the Holy Lands, they could control that Silk Road trade and have greater access to luxury goods at a cheaper price, or at least make more money for themselves. So religious, sure. Political, definitely. Money, most definitely. Now, who participated in these? Well, knights, peasants, middle class, nobles, kings, church authorities, pretty much everyone. If you want to be involved, you can be involved. Participants would receive indulgences. In other words, that they will have any sin they commit removed from their futures, therefore they can go to heaven. They also will have immunity from lawsuits, cancellation of debts, and of course, honor and glory. Now, of course, the most famous of these crusades were aimed at reclaiming Jerusalem and other holy places in the Middle East from Muslim rule. Let's be very clear. These were not peaceful, hey, can I have my land back? No, these were violent. These were brutal. The Crusaders were extremely violent. Kill at all costs if necessary. For instance, in 1099 CE, the Crusaders will indeed seize Jerusalem, and they will slaughter thousands of Muslims and Jewish people who are there. So in the name of God, these Christians are going to slaughter both Muslims and Jews. Now, to be clear, and that's why the most famous ones are at, but it wasn't just the Holy Land that was pushed for in the Crusades. They also targeted Muslims on the Iberian Peninsula in Spain. They targeted the lands near the Baltic Sea. They targeted the Byzantine Empire in Russia. They targeted the enemies of the Pope and opponents of the Catholic Church. And so you see here, while a lot of this has been focused on the spirituality, the religious ideas of retaking the Holy Land, when you look at that list, let me go over that list again. Muslims on the Iberian Peninsula. Okay, so that's religious, cultural thing. Lands of the Baltic Sea, the Byzantine Empire. That's trade issues, so economic money issues. Enemies of the Pope, number 4, and opponents of the Catholic Church, number 5. That's just strictly just punitive because, well, we don't like you. That's just political violence at that point. Now, generally speaking, the Crusades were a failure. They were relatively unsuccessful. Europe did not gain much except for those so-called Crusader states that were along the Mediterranean coast. And to be clear, these became central hubs of Christianity and trade. And Jerusalem would be jointly occupied. So, yeah, there is some tangible land gain, but it's pretty minimal. But what really does change, and where the Crusades could be seen as a success, was the contact with the outside world, the trade of not just goods, but of ideas. For instance, it was the rediscovery of science, math, and philosophy from classical civilizations. Charlemagne would bring teachers to his court and open a school for clergy and officials. After the First Crusade, universities were established in Italy, and others would follow. It began an intellectual revival that would begin to be called the Renaissance, or rebirth. It was a combination of Christian learning, of the classics that had been preserved by Muslims in the Middle East. People like Sir Thomas Aquinas, Albert Magnus, and even Peter Abelard tried to reconcile the values of Christianity with reason. It was developing of the vernacular, including Dante's Divine Comedy, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. In other words, people were not just writing Latin, they were writing in the vernacular now. Cathedrals, architecture, painting, sculptures, stained glass, music, literature. Painting became much more of a dominant, sophisticated endeavor and would lead to the full-blown Renaissance. And of course, it will lead to more trade. It will lead to more spices, foods, silk that will begin to be centered on Western Europe rather than Eastern Europe and the Middle East. It will bring new ideas about banking to the West. Merchants will begin to invest in trading ships. Guilds will form. And we will see the growth of both trading and banking that become the basis of modern Western capitalism. And the church will begin charging interest, which is something that would previously been considered unbiblical. And of course, one of the other big hallmarks of it was, of course, disease. Because disease will be spread across the Silk Road, once again into Western Europe, which will lead to, well, lots of death. We will also see a growth of anti-Semitism as people begin to blame Jews, and both because of the fact that Jews were often the ones in charge of the banks, and therefore they were seen as being evil for charging interest rates, which ironically Jews did that because they were put there by Christians because Christians believed they couldn't charge interest because it was against the Bible. So they allowed Jews to do it instead because it didn't offend their faith. And then they got mad at the Jews for charging interest. So we'll see a tremendous growth of anti-Semitism, and we will see a greater rift between Eastern Orthodox and the Catholic Church. Now, we're going to stop there, and we'll pick up in part 2 and talk about how the Byzantine Empire is remade during this period. So until then, take care, and bye-bye.